This is Join Us in France, episode 366. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel during the pandemic. Today, I bring you a conversation with historian Suzanne Levin about the French Revolution and the circumstances that led to it. This is an episode in two parts. Next week, she'll tell us about the Terror. These events are so complicated to understand. When I heard Suzanne, an American who teaches history in France, on French radio, and she was discussing the finer points of all this historical stuff with other scholars, I thought, she really makes sense. And I bet her English is perfect. And of course it is. History buffs, this one is for you. After the interview, I'll update you briefly about the changes with the COVID situation in France. And if you like what we do here at Join Us in France, consider supporting us by visiting joinusinfrance.com/boutique to check out my cookbook, Join Us at the Table, my Paris tours on the Voice Map app, and you get a discount if you buy from the boutique instead of buying from the app directly. And my itinerary planning service where I help you craft the best vacation in France specifically for you. This service is on vacation until December 26th. And after that, you'll be able to purchase it again. And the best way to stay in touch with me and with the podcast is to sign up for the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. I did not send my newsletter about the French immersion program yet because there's a lot to this and I need to do quite a bit of research before I make a proposal. But if you're interested in coming to France and spending a week with Elise and me and some French teachers, do sign up for the newsletter. I'll talk about it soon. And the expression of the week today is "Il ne faut pas en faire tout un fromage." Bonjour, Susan, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I said Susan, but maybe it's Suzanne, right?
Yes, it is actually Suzanne.
Suzanne.
Although a lot of people make that assumption. But I didn't even change my name. It has always been Suzanne.
Wonderful. Okay, so I have invited you on the podcast because I heard you on a French radio show. And although your French is excellent, you do have a tiny bit of an accent. So I thought, okay, she's probably an American and you're a history professor in a French university. And so I thought, yay, a history professor who can speak English. Yay. Maybe she can explain French history to me, which is quite the job. Anyway, so I'm delighted to have you. Tell us where you teach and tell us how you ended up there.
So thank you, first of all, so much for having me. I'm actually in a little bit of a strange situation, pretty typical actually for academia. I defended my thesis back in 2019, and I don't have a permanent post at this point. I was teaching at the Université de Versailles Saint-Quentin, which is just outside Paris. Not actually in Versailles, despite what the name would suggest. They do have one center in Versailles, but that wasn't where I was. And actually, I just got accepted to do a postdoc, not in France. I'm going to be moving to Italy for a year.
Oh, wow.
Surprisingly. Yeah. Continuing to work on French history, of course, but a lot of the postdocs in France, you have to not have lived in France already. So kind of paradoxically.
Wow, that is bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a little strange, but a lot of the EU, the European Union's funding is very based on wanting people to move around within the European Union. So,
well, that makes sense.
Yeah. So in any case, so how did I end up here to begin with? bit of a long story, but I'll try to give you the short version, which is that basically I first became really interested in French history really pretty early on. I am American. I grew up in California, and like many people, I didn't really take a language until middle school. I started taking French, and then one day, through a roundabout way, I discovered the musical Les Miserables, and then that led me to want to read the book. And then I wanted to read the book in French. And then as I was doing this, I realized, there are a lot of historical references in here, and particularly, of course, as everyone knows, Les Miserables is about a French Revolution, but not what we think of as the French Revolution. But there are a lot of references to it, right?
Right.
And so I started investigating that. And originally, I wanted to write a novel myself about the revolution. But then I just realized I loved doing the research so much. And I was like 14, 15 years old at this point, and I kind of already knew that I wanted to be a historian. So I finished high school. I went to college in the U.S. I went to Oberlin in Ohio, and I studied abroad in France, in Paris. And at that point, I was in a program that allowed me to take classes at French universities. And I met my future thesis director, who invited me to do a master's with him. That's Marc Bélissat, who was a specialist on the French Revolution, among other things. And so I came back for the master's, and I've been here ever since. I came back in 2012. So, and I also, in the meanwhile, ended up getting French citizenship. So I am a dual citizen now.
Oh, excellent. So you can move around Europe. That's another good point about being a French citizen. That's wonderful. Okay.
Yes, for sure.
Okay. So do you think you might come back to France after Italy, or you might?
So I definitely plan to come back to France if I possibly can. Of course, academia is, as anyone who's familiar with it knows, it's a little bit difficult to get a job really anywhere in academia. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I will ultimately be able to get an academic post in France and live here long term.
Sounds wonderful. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to discuss the French Revolution with you, because one of the things that interested me when I heard you on the radio originally is that you specialize in the terror. and there are a lot of things that are really confusing about the terror and about the French Revolution in general. So when we discussed this before today, you said, we could talk about like some misconceptions that people have about the French Revolution. And I think that's a really good idea. So what are some basic misconceptions that Americans and people in general have about the French Revolution?
So I think one major one is there's kind of a tendency for compression. And this is more of kind of the pop history version that, one day the peasants got angry and just started chopping off aristocratic heads, and that's the whole thing. So that's kind of the more like kind of pop history version that you sometimes see people make reference to. And sometimes you think, okay, well, that's just kind of a joke, and they know that that's not really what happened, right? But sometimes
you wonder.
Sometimes it's not entirely clear. Yeah, you wonder. So that's kind of the most basic misconception, if you want to call it that. There are some versions that go a little bit more in depth. I would argue that the way that it's often taught is kind of, there's basically three moments, if you will. You have 1789, where you have all of the principles that happen. You have the Declaration of Rights, and you have the storming of the Bastille, and you have the Women's March on Versailles, and you have all of those important moments, the tennis court oath, mentioning these completely out of chronological order, but you have that kind of soup of major events that happen in 1789. And then you just kind of jump to 1793, 1794, and it's like, well, there was this one guy, Robespierre, who decided to make himself dictator and started chopping off the heads of anyone who disagreed with him. And then one day he got overthrown, and, there was some weak government that happened, and it got overthrown by a military dictatorship at the end.
Yeah, not quite. Yeah.
So there's a lot missing there, but there's also a lot wrong with that picture. I would argue that the most accurate part of that is, kind of the beginning and the end. You do start out with all of these foundational events, although how well people understand how they fit together is another issue. And then you do have this ultimate military dictatorship with the coup d'etat of the 18th of Brumaire in 1799, where Bonaparte overthrows the First Republic, which is called the Directoire or the Directory in this period. But everything in between,
it's a bit of a blur.
There are some problems.
Right. It's a bit of a blur for most people. When I was preparing for this, I thought, maybe I should try and list, set the stage for the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. What led up to it. And of course, like you said, there was a lot of anger with the people. Enough that the king thought it would be a good idea to call the Estates General, which hadn't been done for 100 years or something. I mean, it had been a long time. So
150, yeah.
There you go. And so he decides, I'm going to call. So the Estates General is when the king called all the nobility, all the important people from all over the country to come to Paris and let's all talk. And he figured that was going to help, right?
So, So there are a couple of things about this. So first of all, basically, the king is not really responding to popular anger or even calls for reforms per se. He's basically out of options when it comes to how to solve the bankruptcy crisis, because basically the king is bankrupt, notably after a very expensive 7 Years' War, which France lost, and then the American War of Independence, which people like to go on about court spending, and it's true that the court was very expensive, and notably in terms of legitimacy, do you want your tax money to be going to aristocrats having parties? But in terms of the actual bankruptcy, we're really talking about the war budget that is the cause of that. In any case, he actually tried initially to get the aristocracy to pay taxes, because the aristocracy were exempt from paying taxes. And of course, they had most of the money. So that's a bit of a problem.
It's a big problem.
And so he actually tried various channels. He called what is known as the Assembly of Notables in 1787, a couple of years before the revolution. And that was really when he, is addressing the aristocracy directly and saying, please help me out. The state is out of money. And they basically said, no, our privileges are too important to us. We're not going to give that up.
Right.
And so it was only at that point that he decided, okay, I'm going to have to bring back this institution of the Estates General, which is an institution that goes back to the late Middle Ages, where you start to get this idea that the different estates of society need to consent to taxes. That's actually an idea that goes back further than people think. But essentially, under the absolute state, with Louis XVI's, great grandfather, if I'm getting the right number of greats, because his grandfather was Louis XV, and then Louis XV's grandfather was Louis XIV.
Right.
So skipping generations because of very long reigns.
Right.
Here.
They lived a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. So in any case, he had successfully managed to set up this state, which is sometimes still called absolutist. There are historians that dispute that. But in any case, he no longer needed the Estates General, because he basically had created this situation where he had such an aura around the monarchy that to a certain extent he could persuade the different parts of society to do what he wanted without having recourse to the Estates General. And that remained the case, again, for 150 years. It's a very long time. But finally, Louis XVI, he's out of options. And he says, okay, we're going to go to the Estates General. And, maybe once we get the third estate here, so there are three estates in the society. There's the first estate, which is the clergy, the second estate, which is the nobility, and that's the Catholic clergy, of course. There's only one official church. You're not allowed to belong to any other religion officially. And then the third estate is literally everyone else. Mm-hmm. And so you have these three estates, and basically the first two orders are known as the privileged orders because they don't have to do things like pay taxes, and they have various other privileges as well. things like the right to hunt, which was exclusive to the nobility, or the right to raise local taxes on certain kinds of things, or the right to exercise local justice. In any case, those two privileged orders are exactly the ones that need to be made to pay for the bankruptcy crisis to be resolved. And so what happens basically is that Louis XVI says, okay, we have to ask the Third Estate because they're the only ones who can really put pressure on these privileged orders. And the Third Estate, in the meanwhile, again, the whole rest of society, apart from the clergy and nobility, who it's worth noting, the clergy and nobility taken together make up at most 5% of the population.
Right. So it's teeny, yeah.
Yeah. So we're really dealing with a very small minority, and then of course the majority of the clergy also come from the Third Estate. We're talking parish priests, and not what we think of as the high clergy, like the princes of the church. But in any case, the Third Estate has its own demands, right? So they want reforms of various kinds. And of course, the Third Estate being 95% of the population, they have different demands depending on the categories we're looking at. Basically, everybody in the Third Estate wants the other two orders to pay their fair share of taxes. That's a pretty unanimous demand. But you have, for example, in this period, the Third Estate can't exercise certain kinds of offices. If you're a member of the Third Estate and you join the army, you can't rise above the rank of captain. All of the high church positions are reserved for nobles. So if you become a priest, you can't ever rise. And so there are institutional blockages. So there are some members of the Third Estate who are saying, we want access on the basis of merit to various offices in society. And then you also have the peasantry, who the main thing they want is not actually as the angry peasantry rises up because they're envious of the aristocrats or whatever. What they want actually is just not to be forced to pay seigneurial dues to the people who to own their land. And these are lords, but they're not necessarily aristocrats. A lot of times they are, but if you're an aristocrat and you sell your land, you're selling kind of everything that is attached to that land, including what your tenants owe you in terms of dues, which were, initially justified by the fact that the nobility is supposed to be the class that fights, to protect the peasantry. But this hasn't really been the case for centuries. And yet you're continuing to have to pay those dues. And so the major demand of most of the peasantry is we want to stop having to pay these dues. We want to also have freedom from some of these extra fees that keep piling up. The local lord has a monopoly on using the local mill, for example, and we have to pay every time we want to grind grain to make our bread and all of these sorts of things. And so you have all of these demands that are coming in, and actually these demands, the king, Louis XVI, did invite the population to express their demands. He's portraying himself as kind of this reforming monarch, this paternal figure, which is very important to the legitimization of the monarchy. And so you have this outpouring, and this creates a really great source for historians, of course, of what are known as cahiers de doléances, where everybody all over the place are writing in these cahiers, literally these notebooks, these pamphlets, what their demands are, what reforms they would like to see, etc.
Yeah. And one of the things that you didn't mention that I think came up again and again in the Cahiers de Doléances was they wanted justice to be done fairly, because justice was kind of arbitrary. In one village, it could be decided one way, and in the next village, it was decided another way. And so people never knew what was what.
Yes, exactly. So that was another major demand for judiciary reform. Again, we're really dealing with a society of orders, a society of privileges, and basically every province and sometimes every town had their own local privileges and their own local laws, sometimes their own money, their own measurement system, and of course their own local justice. So there were some parts of the country that were dependent on different parlement, which were not parliaments as we might think of them, but the highest law courts. And those had kind of their own way of dealing with things. You also had a broad distinction between parts of France that had been really integrated into the sphere of what had been the Roman Empire and Gaul, and who had what was known as the written law. So they had much more influence from Roman law on how judicial decisions were made. And then in the north, you had the country of more of more of the common law that comes more from Germanic roots. And so you had that broad distinction, but then every little part of the country, every province, and sometimes, again, as you said, from village to village, things could be very different. In addition, you had a lot of, as you say, arbitrary interference in the judicial system. You have what were known as lettres de cachet, where a member of your family who didn't like you for whatever reason, usually it was parents locking up their children who they decided were embarrassing the family.
Yeah.
And so you could basically just write to the king and have your family member locked away for years on end with no kind of due process whatsoever.
Right. And usually for a nice donation, usually. I mean, the king didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart. There was usually something, strings attached somehow. But yeah, you could get, and some people got locked up just because they just didn't fit in the family, or and the king didn't have to explain anything. He could just send whoever to jail for no reason whatsoever.
Right, exactly. And then you also have a little bit lesser known fact, but in criminal cases, you actually not only had no right to a lawyer, but couldn't have one. It wasn't just that, we don't give you a lawyer if you can't pay. It's like, no, you have to defend yourself. And of course, most people
don't know
not
how.
Particularly capable of doing that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was crazy. The Cahiers de doléances are just fascinating, and you can read. There's been books published that are kind of a summary of some things, and some of them. Very often it was actually the priest who wrote for the people, which is kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Some priests so the people would knock on the door of the priest and say, okay, you know how to write and I don't, so you write it. There were places where women wrote in the Cahiers de doléances because the girls knew how to write and their brothers didn't. Anyway, so it was really interesting to see this whole group of people coming together, and I think they had hope that it would work, but obviously since the state was broke, he couldn't do any of these things without raising a lot more money. Another thing that's interesting to me is that one of the things that happened just a few days before the taking of the Bastille is that Necker was kind of told to go away. So did people like Necker? Was he in their camp? Because he was the Ministry of Finance, right?
Right. So there are a couple of things. There are a couple of things that it's important to understand about politics in the pre-revolutionary era, which is that officially nobody is supposed to have any kind of say in it. There's not supposed to be a public opinion. In theory, politics is like the king's private possession. Now, as it happens, people, are starting to form opinions about politics in any case, and you start having these clandestine pamphlets circulating about politics. And so we do kind of get this impression, there are conflicts in the last years of the Ancien Regime between the parliaments and the king. There are conflicts between the ministers and the king, and this is actually not the first time that Necker had been sent away. He had been minister previously, and he was sent away. And then, as I said, the king had really tried everything leading up to the Estates General to avoid having to call the Estates General to fix the financial problem. So he'd been blowing through ministers basically on a yearly basis throughout the 1780s. So there's kind of this notion among certain people that, so the king is representing this kind of absolute despotic power. So kind of anybody who is seeming to want reforms of any kind, anybody who might be seeming to go against this kind of despotism is maybe a positive figure. And Necker in particular is kind of the opposite of some of the ministers that preceded him, like Lomini de Brienne and Calonne, who were viewed as more hardline. No, we're not going to do any necessary reforms. We're going to defend the interests of the nobility. And so I think that he was popular for that reason. Certainly, he's not what we would call a major reformer. He's basically asking, for the basics, we don't have any money, so we do need to call on the privileged orders to pay taxes, and just for that alone, he was immensely popular. It's also worth noting that Necker, contrary to some other ministers, was in favor of not creating certain kinds of reforms. Notably, he was against liberalizing the grain trade, because it's important to recognize that one of the major roles of the monarchy in this period is to make sure that the people have bread. And one way that they did this was by creating price controls on bread, by regulating the grain market. And there were a number of people, including among the future revolutionaries, who wanted to open up the grain market. They said, if we just have free circulation of grain, everything will be great. Speculation doesn't exist. That's just, a figment of people's imaginations. Everything will be fine. But of course, when they actually tried those reforms, both before and during the revolution, there was speculation,
Sure.
and the prices rose. So Necker was also popular in a sense for going against those kinds of reforms, because the grain market is not elastic. If you can't get bread, you don't eat cake. Of course, as everyone knows, that's not something that Marie Antoinette ever said.
Right.
But the point remains: if most of your diet is bread and bread becomes unaffordable, there's really not a lot else you can do except starve. So Necker was popular for that reason as well.
Right. Yeah. It's very interesting that it just happened so fast at that point that it's kind of startling. Okay. So now I'm afraid I'm going to do what you don't like, which is go to much later, and we're going to skip a whole bit because I would like you to explain. I mean, you're great at explaining this stuff. So maybe you can help me understand the terror. What the hell happened?
Okay, so this is where kind of skipping a lot of stuff makes it a little bit difficult to explain. So I'm gonna try to fill in a little bit of the gaps here. So you have this initial Estates General, which is going to the third estate is going to transform it into a national assembly. They're going to write a new constitution, etc., because that was the other major reform that they wanted, was a written constitution and a regular legislature to have what was considered a free state. They didn't like using the word republic at that time for various reasons. It became kind of taboo, despite the fact that initially it wasn't viewed as contrary to a limited monarchy. Limited monarchy was considered a type of republic. But in any case, they wanted a free state. They wanted a situation where the people could elect representatives, and those representatives would write the law. The king would have a much more limited role. And in fact, a lot of people didn't want the king to even have the role that he ends up having in the initial constitution, which gave him a very large pension to do with what he wished. He was still allowed to name his own cabinet of ministers, and he, most importantly, had a veto, which was a suspensive veto, so he couldn't veto legislation indefinitely, but he could still do so for 3 legislatures. So you have to imagine having, a law that 3 legislatures in a row all want badly enough to be able to override this. So it's pretty absolute, at least in the short run. So the king still has a lot of power with this constitution, which ends up being a problem because the king just cannot accept his role as a constitutional monarch. It has been, bred into him from childhood. He's been educated in this notion that he is anointed by God to be the sole arbiter, that anything else, he can receive advice, but he should have the last word on everything. And So he is, from the beginning thinking of ways, okay, how can I get around this? How can I undermine this? How can I turn things back to the way they were before 1789? And honestly, if you want to get at the issue of, how do we get to what people call the terror, because as I'll get to in a minute, it's not something that I really want to reify. I don't think it makes sense to say, yes, there was a terror. Certainly there was a situation of foreign and civil war, there was repression, but I think that thinking about it as, the terror and how did we get to the terror is actually kind of asking the wrong question. And I'll get to that.
Again,
I'll get to that in just
I do that again.
Right. But if we want to understand, where this situation of crisis, if you want to call it that way, comes from, it really, a lot of it comes down to the fact that there are people, the king first among them, who just cannot accept revolutionary reforms. Like even minor ones are like pulling teeth with a lot of these people. You have aristocrats who leave France and emigrate starting in 1789. Like they can't even stand again, like relatively what we might think of as moderate reforms. These are we're not dealing at this point with a total overhaul of society. It's not really democratic at this point, especially since the Constituent Assembly is actually going to limit suffrage to people who earn a certain amount of money. You have to pay in taxes the equivalent of 3 days' wages, which is beyond the means a certain percentage of the population. And of course, we're mostly talking about men here, but it's not 100% clear cut because basically up until the revolution, people voted by who is the head of the family rather than having individual votes. And some of those heads of family were women, particularly widows.
Yeah.
And a lot of them do actually continue to vote throughout this period. So there's kind of a vagueness about the legislation that allows that to happen. So you have this situation where the king can't accept the constitutional monarchy and is using his still considerable power to undermine it at every turn. You also have a considerable number of people from the privileged orders who can't accept losing their privileges, because one of the things that happens in 1789, and this is important, there's a loss of aristocratic privilege in the sense of you no longer have the exclusive rights to hunt, for example, or you no longer have your private jurisdiction where you can judge cases in your local seigneurial court.
Yeah.
But in terms of the foundation of their economic power, those seigneurial dues, those are not abolished in 1789. And that becomes an important point as well, because you have people resisting to make the revolution go further and actually accomplish that.
Right.
Right.
You had some moderates and you had some really far out people who wanted to go all the way.
Right. Well, I mean, I would argue that the ones who can't accept the constitutional monarchy are pretty non-moderate themselves. They're pretty extreme.
In their own way, yes.
Yeah. So in any case, so you have all these resistance to the revolution, and this is often, we're talking about armed resistance going in. You have people who are emigrating and then trying to convince France's neighbors to declare war on France. You have people who are organizing armed uprisings, like with the camps of Jalais in southern France. You have all of these things going on.
Right, and there's a lot of French people outside of Paris who don't really want the revolution to begin with. They're quite happy.
So that's a little bit complicated. So most of the vast majority of the population, including the peasantry, because it's important to remember that the French Revolution is not just Parisian; it's a peasant revolution largely, because that's the majority of the population.
Yeah,
they do want the revolution initially, but what happens is they keep seeing their demands completely ignored, which is again why they keep rising up periodically until 1793, saying, what we want from this revolution is an end to the real power of the local lords. We want to have our land belong to us, and so you have that going on. And then in 1791, so this is 2 years into the revolution, the king decides to run away. He says, I'm going to run away into Austria. That's
his wife's
a
country.
place from, my wife is from there, and her brother, the Austrian emperor, is going to help me regain my crown at the head of a foreign army. And when I say his crown, he's still king at this point. He just doesn't have the kind of powers that he had before, but he does get recognized and brought back to Paris. And there's some debate over, like, do we even need a king at that point? But they basically decide, as long as Louis XVI says, I am going to swear my loyalty to the Constitution, we're just going to forget about everything he's done up until now and believe him and try to move forward with it. So they do that, not before massacring a bunch of peaceful petitioners who wanted to see, if not a republic, at least kind of a referendum on the question. So this is something that's happening in 1791. So these episodes of violence, it's important to note, are not just coming from the most quote-unquote radical revolutionaries, nor are they just springing up one day out of nowhere in 1793. But in any case, so you have Louis XVI who says, yes, I swear loyalty to the Constitution. I'm fine with it now. I'm going to be a constitutional monarch, of course, while continuing to do everything he can to undermine it. And then, as I mentioned, so you have these émigrés who are grouping on France's borders in Austria and other neighboring countries, and they basically get the Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia to sign a pact, which says basically that they're going to come and interfere in France's government if France continues down the revolutionary path. And it's probably the case. A lot of historians think that if France had not declared war on Austria, and then of course Prussia comes into it because Austria and Prussia are allies, there are a lot of historians who think that the war was not at all inevitable, and that sure, these powers were not happy with the revolution happening and they were afraid of revolutionary contagion, but that they probably, they had bigger fish to fry. There's also the partition of Poland that's going on in this period. So they're more interested in getting a slice of Poland at this point than they are in France. But regardless of whether that's true, there are a certain number of people in France who think that war is either inevitable or at least that it would be a good idea. We're going to liberate Europe. We're going to kickstart the economy. We're going to do all of these things, and it'll be like an easy jaunt. And the usual thing that people who want to start a war say, oh, it'll be easy and it'll be over in a few weeks or months. And of course, that's rarely the case.
Right. That was usually the Girondins, right? That went in that direction. Yeah. Okay.
So this is a group that will be called the Girondins eventually. That's a term that's actually like a lot more common starting in the 19th century.
Okay.
Mostly they're called at the time by names that evoke some of their leaders. So they're called Brissotin after Brissot, who was a major journalist and member of the Legislative Assembly. That's the one that's elected with the new constitution after the Constituent Assembly. And then you have Rolandin, they're sometimes called after the Minister of the Interior, Roland, who's another major person in this group. But in any case, so you have this group that's really fighting for a war. You have other revolutionaries like Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, who's another famous journalist, Billaud Varennes, another future member of the Committee of Public Safety, Marat, again, one of the most famous revolutionaries, mostly famous for being assassinated later. But in any case, so you have this group of kind of the more democratic revolutionaries who are opposed to the war, saying, we're massively unprepared for this. The king is still in power. This is not going to end well. And then you have, and then if we win, even, it's going to just end up with a military dictatorship. They're already saying that. In 1791. And of course, the person that they're most afraid of, and this is going to, I think, shock a lot of American listeners, is Lafayette.
Of course, they're afraid of Lafayette. Yeah.
Yeah. So Lafayette in this period is I mean, he actually did kind of try to seize power using his army. So that's something that is kind of a legitimate fear. Definitely not the reputation that Lafayette has in the United States, but
Right, right.
um, but in any case, so the other group that is of course pushing for this war is the king and the court party, because they're hoping to lose, right? Because if they lose, then they get reestablished in their former power and privilege, and they can go back on all of the revolutionary reforms.
Yep.
And in the meanwhile, there's a third major factor that needs to be mentioned, which is the religious factor, because basically, and this is something that I find particularly interesting, from our contemporary perspective, it never seems to occur to anyone in this period to even suggest the possibility that, okay, France is bankrupt, we could just default on the monarchy's debts and start over. They are very much in this mindset that every single denier, that's the smallest denomination of money that is owed by the crown, needs to be paid off full. And because of this, it's not going to suffice for, just the aristocracy to start paying taxes ultimately, especially if you want to be funding new reforms at the same time. And so what they decide as a solution to this is the nationalization of church property. And this is something that's already been done in a number of other countries, notably something that was done during the Protestant Reformation. But the idea here is not, to down with the Catholic Church or whatever. The idea is to say, okay, the Catholic Church exists to serve the people. The church is the people and not the church hierarchy. And, the church lands and properties should belong to the nation that they're situated in, and not.
And it was massive too. I mean, the church owned like half of France or something like that. It was a lot.
Right. So it's variable depending on what region you're in, but there were definitely regions where, I mentioned that local lords weren't only aristocrats. Sometimes you could have like an abbey that owned like a massive amount of land, and then you're paying your seigneurial dues to that abbey. And so you have, a massive ownership of land by the church, a massive amount of wealth and power. So you have this idea, okay, we'll just nationalize church properties, and then priests will receive a salary from the nation. So the new state will pay their salary, and that way they don't need to have all this property, right? In the meantime, you also have an opening up freedom of religion to the extent that now it's okay to believe what you want openly and publicly. You can be a Protestant, you can be a Jew, you can be whatever, and that's now legal. However, the only people whose salaries are being paid are the Catholic clergy because of church nationalization again. So you have kind of this hybrid system where Catholicism is no longer the official religion and certainly no longer the only religion, but it's still very much not separation of church and state.
Of course.
And so basically the problem with this is it's a fairly standard thing in all realms of life in the revolution to ask people to swear an oath to the new regime, the new system, and its new principles. The original oath is the nation, the law, the king, and this is pretty standard. And it doesn't, as you can tell, have any religious content per se, but it ends up being a problem because in order for the clergy to receive their salary from the nation, they ask them to swear this oath of loyalty again to the nation, the law, and the king. And then the Pope condemns the whole thing. The Pope at the time, Pius VI. And he says, this is heresy. The rights of man is heresy, which is kind of ironic because the concept of natural rights was developed within the church, but that's a story for another day. But in any case, so he says, this is all heresy, and anybody who goes along with it is now a heretic. So then you have all of these, ordinary parish priests who are in a dilemma. Do I swear this oath or not? And you basically get a pretty even split overall. So it's about 50-50 for priests swearing the oath or not. But by region, it's extremely variable. You have regions where almost all the priests swear the oath, and other regions where almost all the priests don't swear the oath.
Right.
And in the regions where they don't, they're also there's a tendency basically to tell the parishioners, if you continue to support the revolution, you're going to hell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Minor
this creates, this creates a major religious split as well. And what's interesting is, so the revolutionaries kind of understandably say, well, okay, if you're not going to swear this oath, then you can still exercise privately as a priest, but we're going to bring in someone new to be the official person who's going to get paid by the state because, you kind of refuse the terms of the contract. And this upsets a lot of people, not because they necessarily care about the controversy per se, but because they don't want the state coming in and telling them who their local priest can be.
Right, so, of course. But I mean, of course, duh.
Yeah. So you get this major religious divide.
Yeah.
And then to get back to the war, you finally get the king who declares war on, what was the formula? The king of Bohemia and Hungary, i.e. the Austrian Empire. Emperor, sorry. And of course, the King of Prussia joins in afterwards because of the pact that he had with the Austrian Emperor. And so now you have France at war with these two countries. More will join later, and we'll get to that. But in any case, France starts losing very badly, as you might expect for a country that is completely unprepared and that has the head of the executive branch and also, incidentally, the head of all the armies sabotaging the thing because he wants to lose.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's just crazy. That's just yeah. And see, this is why all the books about this, and I've read a few, at one point I'm like, okay, my head is going to explode. I can't keep track of all these people.
But to cut a long story short, you have this losing war. People realize that it's the king that's sabotaging them. And then they're like, okay, well, we need to get rid of the monarchy. Something needs to happen. And they petition the Legislative Assembly to do this. And the Legislative Assembly is like, I don't know, doing something sounds like that could cause problems for us either way. So they don't do anything. So ultimately, a number of Parisians and also people who have come in from the provinces to help fight the war overthrow the monarchy. And they decide to elect a new constituent assembly, which is going to be called the convention on the American model, constitutional convention, to write a new constitution for France. And basically, at this point, France is losing the war on all sides. You have the election of this convention. The convention is immediately split into not two camps the way you might think of it, as like there are only two parties that you can belong to the way we might think of it today. They're not really parties in that sense, and most of the convention is kind of undecided, unaffiliated. But in any case, you have these two groups, the Brissotin, Rolandin, sometimes called Girondins later on, and then the Montagnards. The Montagnards are kind of the left wing of the assembly, and incidentally, that's not an anachronistic term. They used left wing and right wing come from the French Revolution,
right?
So you have the left wing, which is the Montagnards, and the right wing, which is the Brissotin, and they're basically arguing over things like, what do we do about the king? What do we do about the influence of the popular militants on politics? Should they have influence on the convention, or should we be like absolutely 100% independent beyond any kind of influence, etc.? And then what should we do in terms of, this is a very dangerous situation. Do we take any kind of emergency measures? Do we take repressive measures against people who are fighting against the revolution? And, are we legitimate to do that? And if we do that, how do we do it? And basically, at a certain point, they need new recruits as well. So they're not getting enough volunteers. So they decree not what exactly a draft, but basically that every department, every region has to give a certain quota of soldiers. And there are some regions where that works better than others. If you're a region near the border, then obviously you see the interest in doing that. If you're a more insular, isolated region, then you might not. And so that's kind of just the last straw.
That was the first time they instituted a sort of military service in France.
On a national level. Right. Because there had been the king's militia could force regions to draw lots
Yes,
before the
okay.
revolution, and this was a pretty bitter memory for most of the population. And so you have that memories of that coming back in, and so this is kind of the last straw for populations who are, you know, peasant populations who are like, okay, well, they haven't abolished seigneurial dues, which was the main thing I wanted out of this revolution. They're telling me that I can't have my local priest anymore because of some controversy that I don't really care about. But in any case, that's something that I do care about. And then in addition, they're saying that I have to go fight in this war that is very far away from me and my concerns. What about the harvest? I don't want to die. You know, all of these things.
Right.
And so you get these uprisings a little bit all over the place, and the worst of which, largely through mismanagement more than any particularity of this region, is in the Vendée. So you have this major civil war going on, and then basically this is where we get this situation. We have foreign war, we have civil war, and then you have the government saying, okay, well, we need some kind of repressive measures. We keep having generals that are betraying the revolution and going over to the enemy. We keep having corruption scandals. We need to have some way to repress this and keep it in check. And we need to have institutions that allow us to concentrate power, because we can't at this point just hold elections and go back to normal. We're fighting at this point a war against all of Europe, because essentially early in 1793, Spain and the United Provinces, that's the Netherlands at the time, and England all joined in a coalition against France. And because, again, they're afraid of this revolutionary contagion. In the case of Great Britain, they see it as a way of taking their rival down a peg, because, of course, they're still upset about the American War of Independence. And so you basically have France dealing with all of this situation. And that's where we get to what is known generally as the Terror. And what we're really looking at is an extreme situation of a republic that is trying to be founded in the midst of foreign and civil war. And there are excesses, there are atrocities committed in the course of this, which, again, I wish I could get into more detail, but essentially what happens...
Hold this thought, because I think, okay, you've wrapped this up. You've gotten us to the point where the Terror is about to start. I think what we need to do is say goodbye for today, and then continue later, because you probably have plenty to tell us about the Terror as well.
Oh, yeah.
Would that be okay?
That's definitely fair. Yeah, I would love to continue this another day and kind of get into all of that a little bit more.
You sound just fascinating. It's really interesting. You know, for somebody who's tried to get into, to sink my teeth into lots of books about the French Revolution, you've really brought it to life. So this is wonderful, and I thank you.
Oh, well.
And if you can help me understand the Terror next, then we're going to be best friends.
Well, thank you so much. I will do my best.
Okay. Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Patreon. Join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you for a long time. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Marie Roberts, Mary Pygot, and Celeste Broussard. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. Bonjour, Elise.
Bonjour, Annie.
How's your Patreon going?
My Patreon is coming along. It's always a little bit on the sort of slow and steady side.
That's all right.
That's, I just put out a new episode after, of course, this little period of convalescence that I went through. And I would love to get some more feedback. It was called The Two Louises, about two very interesting women artists. And I just would like to say a very big thank you to Scott, who is always someone who reacts and sends comments. And I really, really do appreciate that.
Yeah,
very,
that's
very
nice.
much.
Yeah.
He's really a sweetheart for that. And I would like to welcome 3 new people. And that is Dawn and Jeff and his wife, Kathy, and Rhonda. And they are my 3 new members of Patreon.
Thank you so much. That's great.
And I just we'll be coming up with something soon for the letter M. And hopefully it will be able to get out before we take the Christmas break.
Right.
before Annie takes her Christmas break and everything closes down for the holidays. So.
And Elise has recovered from her surgery very, very nicely. Well done, Elise.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Hip. There you go.
To become one of Elise's patron, go to patreon.com, Patreon/Elise Art, ELYSART. And thank you very much.
And thank you.
My thanks also to Cipriano Pineno, Leslie Hill, Michelle Pagny, Celeste Williams, and Linda Sakay for sending in a one-time donation by using the green button on any page on joinusinfrance.com that says tip your guide. Celeste wrote, "Thank you so much for your podcast and Facebook group. I've gotten invaluable information for my trip and enjoy communicating with you and Elise and the other members. This week I published a French history brief where I talk about Josephine Baker and ask the question, are French people really less racist than Americans? And those of you who support the show on Patreon or with a one-time donation can use their addictedtofrance.com login to enjoy this extra content. The Pantheon ceremony honoring Josephine Baker was absolutely stunning. It was beautiful and moving and the best one I've ever watched, and I've watched a few. And you know, when those big doors opened to let her in, it was quite moving. Visitors like you and me can enter the Pantheon, but we enter through the small doors that are on the left. The big doors only open for the greats. If you're curious what it was like, you can find clips on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. I must say, this was a proud moment for France and for Americans and for French Americans. If you're looking for the newest official information on travel to France, take a look at Jenny Wenham's post pinned to the top of the Join Us in France group on Facebook. She will keep the latest info pinned where it's easy to find. The moderators are doing an amazing job keeping the conversation civil, helpful, and upbeat at the same time. I am so grateful for all the work that the moderators do. Merci beaucoup. With this new wave of the variant and new restrictions, things are changing fast. Make sure you check on the rules a few days before your trip and don't rely on stale information. Embassies and airlines get the final say on who flies to France and who doesn't. Make sure you seek out official information from the best sources. And one place that makes it easy to look for this sort of info, it's not official, but it's a good place to start. It's called joinsherpa.com. For some reason, this site lists all the requirements to and from any country in the world. It's quite impressive what they're doing. Now, it's possible that everyone is overreacting to this Omicron new variant, but we won't know for a few more weeks. And it's always a problem because everybody wants to know, but nobody knows really. And so it's just speculation that goes around, and it's a bit frustrating. Anyway, the wave that we're experiencing in France right now is still linked to the Delta variant. And for that, we know that vaccination works, and demand for booster shots has exploded in France. We continue to get around 20,000 people each day who get their first dose of the vaccine, which makes me say, what took them so long? But at the same time, better late than never. Thank you for finally going through with this. My husband and I got our booster already. Our daughter is trying to get hers before we board on a plane to spend Christmas with my husband's family in the US. And it's not going to be easy. Priority is given to first doses and folks over 65, which makes total sense. She's only 23. We'll keep trying, but she might have to wait a little bit. Massive vaccination centers are reopening all over France to meet the demand. Hospitals in France are really busy, but not overwhelmed. For those of you who have a trip planned for next spring, I hope we'll be in much better shape by then. But of course, only time will tell. French tip of the week. Il ne faut pas en faire tout un fromage. Don't make a whole cheese out of this. As you know, it takes a long time to make most French cheeses. So if you make a whole cheese out of something, you're blowing it out of proportions. We could have picked a lot of other expressions. We could have said, don't make a baby out of this, because it also takes a long time to make a baby. But no, we're in France. We chose cheese. Il ne faut pas en faire tout un fromage, which, could be translated quite well by it's not the end of the world. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/366, the numeral, where you can see a recap of what we've discussed, as well as links to relevant resources. And if you enjoy the show, introduce a friend to the podcast and tell them why you listen. Next week on the podcast, the second part of my conversation with Dr. Levin, where she explains what happened with the Terror, which is one of the most puzzling things to happen in French history. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2021 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.